brutal dawn. Hans, a trembling finger on the trigger, faces a fog of artillery and death. Explosions rain down, comrades buried alive, a friend's hand reaching from the mud, the whistle of bullets, the roar of machine guns, chaos incarnate. Hans, spade in hand, fights for survival. The enemy's face inches away. Blood, sweat, and fear bind them. As the fog lifts, silence falls, but the echoes of war remain. What drives a man to fight when hope is lost, and what becomes of those who survive? In the maelstrom of World War II, a staggering 17 million men found themselves swept into the ranks of the German Wehrmacht army. Whether they marched forward as zealous volunteers or reluctant conscripts, each Nazi soldier emerged as an emblem of the Third Reich's ruthlessly efficient, fanatically devoted war machine. Yet beneath that ominous uniform bearing the twisted cross, what secrets lay hidden? What stories unfolded in the daily existence of young men bound to fight for Hitler's vision of Germany? Through this exploration, we shall delve into the intimate reality of Nazi soldiers' lives, from the brutal conditioning and relentless barracks discipline to the nightmarish trials of frontline combat, moral battles within their souls and their ultimate destinies after the guns fell slipped. Startling revelations await your discovery. We shall expose, for instance, how countless German warriors fought their battles while coursing with powerful stimulant chemicals. Come then, let us peer deeper into the lives of those whose everyday existence became synonymous with warfare. The transformation from civilian to soldier began with merciless conditioning and ideological molding. Every aspiring Nazi soldier endured punishing preparation. The moment fresh recruits crossed the threshold of military barracks, iron discipline seized them from their very first breath. Dawn reveille pierced the darkness, followed by rigid roll calls, exhausting physical drills, then scrubbing floors until they gleamed and polishing weapons to perfection, all beneath the hawk-like scrutiny of non-commissioned officers who showed no mercy in their shouting or harsh corrections. Physical conditioning pushed human limits. Raw recruits pounded out endless kilometers weighed down by full combat equipment. They mastered the art of marching in flawless, synchronized formations and conquered brutal obstacle courses. Army medical documentation reveals that despite receiving hearty daily rations of approximately 30 and 800 calories, nearly 70% of recruits shed weight during their initial weeks. The regimen demanded such intensity. The objective was forging young men into steel, capable of enduring crushing fatigue and gnawing hunger. This relentless drilling and shared agony simultaneously welded the unit together. Deep brotherhoods bloomed among comrades as they shared countless cups of that bitter brew they called military life. Before long, they functioned as a precisely calibrated machine, each man trusting his life to the others. Yet physical prowess alone would not suffice. Soldiers underwent systematic ideological indoctrination. The Nazi regime demanded that even common Wehrmacht members be saturated with the Third Reich's fervent spirit. Each newly enlisted soldier swore a sacred oath of absolute loyalty to Adolf Hitler, pledging personal obedience unto their final breath. During ceremonial assemblies, martial music thundered while they often raised their voices in the party anthem Horst Wessel lied to kindle their fighting spirit. Between training exercises, political education sessions commenced. Patriotic orations filled recruits' ears, propaganda newsreels flickered before their eyes, and officers hammered into their consciousness that they battled against inferior racial enemies. Whether Jewish Bolsheviks, Russians from the Eastern Territories, or degenerate Anglo-Americans from the West. Elite formations like the Waffen-SS endured even more intensive ideological saturation, though throughout the Wehrmacht, propaganda permeated young minds. Most recruits had already spent their childhood years in the Hitler Youth, arriving at military service with minds already shaped to believe in German racial supremacy and the Reich's destined invincibility. Training regimens typically stretched across several grueling months. Recruits mastered their equipment arsenal, from the trusty Kar-98 rifle to grenade-throwing techniques and deadly bayonet combat. Hundreds of precious hours vanished into shooting practice, bayonet charges, lightning-fast gas mask deployment, and machine gun operation. Absolute emphasis fell upon order and uniformity. Morning beds required meticulous arrangement, uniforms demanded spotless perfection, and boots must always gleam like mirrors. Every breach of discipline brought swift punishment. Additional kilometers of running, dozens of extra push-ups, canceled leave privileges, or in severe cases, days locked away in military prison. The goal was completely shattering civilian habits and molding soldiers into machines of unconditional obedience. Within the barracks walls, everyone rapidly learned that superior officers' commands were sacred scripture, and resistance simply did not exist as an option. Throughout training, young recruits also tasted the bitter reality of military hierarchy. Veterans, seasoned soldiers, and non-commissioned officers frequently reminded newcomers of their lowly status. An unwritten tradition of hazing and mockery persisted until each recruit proved his worth. For boys from rural backgrounds, the closed world of German barracks could initially deliver shocking culture shock, though they soon adapted. From uncertain youth, they gradually metamorphosed into confident warriors, capable of dismantling and reassembling rifles blindfolded, marching 30 kilometers without rest, and responding to commands like precision machinery. When the moment arrived for their final oath ceremony, many swelled with pride. They had become legitimate fighters of the Greater German Reich. For army leadership, successful training culminated in units functioning as single organisms, with every soldier prepared to execute orders with 100% dedication. Soon we shall witness what typical field days looked like for soldiers beyond training camps, exploring what they consumed, where they rested, and how they spent precious leisure moments. Daily existence in rear areas, meals, rest periods, and small pleasures. Following successful training completion, soldiers were dispatched to combat units at the front lines or in occupied territories. Their daily routines then depended upon whether they remained stationed in rear positions or deployed in active combat zones. Extensive time passed outside direct fighting, moving troops, awaiting orders, conducting patrols, and managing minor duties. In frontline existence, long hours of monotonous routine and crushing boredom dominated over brief moments of pure terror. So what did typical days look like for German soldiers when they weren't dodging enemy bullets? Mornings typically began at the earliest possible moment after dawn. If the unit spent nights in rear camps or villages distant from combat, soldiers might awaken at least on straw mattresses in barns or improvised encampments. However, frequently soldiers slept only in trenches or dugouts, wrapped in military blankets and overcoats. After sunrise came unit roll calls and status inspections. Even on front lines, attendance was recorded and routine duties performed. Before departing for posts or beginning marches, men received breakfast from field kitchens nicknamed in German Kanon goulash, a large mobile cauldron mounted on carts with chimneys resembling cannons. Breakfast typically consisted of hot beverages, coffee substitutes made from chicory or bitter tea, plus bread rations. Each soldier received approximately 750 grams of solid black bread daily. The Kommissbrot, from which he sliced his breakfast portion, was usually spread with thin layers of margarine or jam when available. On certain Sundays or holidays, soldiers received small treats like pieces of sweet pastry called snails. Sweet rolls with raisins to remind them of home's flavors. But ordinary weekday mornings remained modest and calories had to come primarily later in the day. After breakfast, soldiers dispersed to fulfill their assignments. Typical morning programs in rear areas included equipment and weapon maintenance, firearm cleaning, rifle and machine gun oiling, ammunition inspection, gear mending, uniform stitching, worn sock replacement, and similar tasks. Next came guard duties and patrols. The Army maintained constant vigilance, and men rotated through posts from which they watched for potential enemy attacks or supervised prisoners and supplies. Soldiers also spent considerable time digging, whether excavating new trenches and defensive positions, or latrines and graves for fallen comrades. Digging with small shovels became part of daily frontline grind. whether in scorching summer heat or frozen winter ground. Those without specific assignments tried maintaining their equipment, drying wet boots, brushing mud from uniforms, or perhaps boiling their mess kits when opportunities arose. Lunch usually arrived from field kitchens if units remained in relatively calm conditions. Soldiers queued with their mess kits at serving cauldrons. Often they received AOPF, literally one-pot meals, like thick potato soup with vegetables and meat pieces, or canned goulash with bread. Lentil porridge or pea soup proved popular choices. Erswurst, a dried mixture that cooks dissolved in water for quickly filling meals. Lunch typically provided the day's most substantial nourishment and traditionally contained mainly potatoes. Germans cherished potatoes prepared countless ways, and soldiers often consumed over 1 kilogram of potatoes daily. Meat was distributed rather symbolically, sometimes as small bacon cubes or sausage for seasoning, other times as several beef pieces in sauce. Field soldiers made do with available provisions. They consumed abundant cabbage, beets, dried pasta, or flour dumplings, but fresh fruits or dairy products rarely appeared. Nevertheless, German command ensured troops received maximum calories and vitamins from available sources. For instance, all broths and vegetable cooking waters were recycled into sauces, ensuring no nutrients were wasted. Occasionally, fruit was preserved and dried, obtained by soldiers during summer campaigns in conquered territories. Or salads were prepared from field grass and herbs to provide vitamin C. Frontline survival often reduced to bare necessities. Hunger became soldiers' constant companion, especially on the Eastern Front where supply chains crumbled. For example, the encircled 6th Army at Stalingrad during winter 1942-43 suffered severe food shortages. Some soldiers wrote home that they hadn't tasted bread for 3 days and survived on single ladles of thin soup daily. In such crises, substantial lunches became distant memories. Everything edible was consumed. Extremes included slaughtering horses for meat or eating dried cattle feed. After lunch, when circumstances permitted, units would withdraw for midday rest. Exhausted soldiers spread out in summer shade or by winter fires, and the fortunate allowed themselves brief naps known as Schluffig. Many used these breaks for writing letters home. Field postal service proved immensely crucial for morale. Each day, soldiers eagerly awaited postmen, often fellow soldiers carrying mail sacks, hoping for letters from family or loved ones. When packages from home arrived, they became small celebrations. Soldiers could indulge in home-baked cookies, sausages, or other family delicacies, share with comrades, and momentarily forget military rations. Ordinary letters home allowed soldiers to express their feelings, though self-censorship and official censorship prohibited writing truth about frontline horrors, so writers mostly conveyed that they were faring well. Trench soldiers often depicted idyllic small details, such as witnessing beautiful sunsets or reminiscing about their mother's cooking. To reassure loved ones, they also penned sincere lines about love and longing. I think of you every day, my dear wife, and pray for peace to come soon so I may return to you and our son. Many preserved letters contain such sentiments. These letters were often greasy, written in cramped handwriting in trenches amid thundering artillery, but for soldiers, they were worth their weight in gold. They maintained connections with the normal world and provided hope, reasons to survive. Free time on the front remained rare, but when it occurred, soldiers sought ways to entertain themselves and unwind. Among the most popular pastimes were card games. They played mariage or skat, dice, and chess. Many soldiers carried small books. Some had prayer books or Bibles. Others carried favorite poets or novels. If fighting lulled, small fires could be lit in evenings, though with discovery risks. Around these fires, comrades softly hummed songs. The song Lily Marlin proved extremely popular across all armies, a mournful melody about a girl waiting for her soldier, which German soldiers heard on radio and sometimes sang in hushed voices themselves. Occasionally, they acquired accordions or concertinas, and musically gifted soldiers would play for their comrades, albeit quietly to avoid attracting enemy attention. In larger rear cities, soldiers visited field cinemas showing propaganda films or newsreels, but only outside combat zones. A more common joy was shaving and washing a little. Hygiene presented frontline problems, so when they found clean wells or even field showers, washing lines would form. Germans valued cleanliness, so whenever possible, they washed clothes, often only in cold water, in their helmets, and tried removing ever-present lice. Nevertheless, almost all frontline soldiers were infested with lice, and dirt was omnipresent. Sludge, soot, blood, and dust ingrained in uniforms. When units were pulled back from front lines after extended periods, men faced thorough cleansing at delousing stations. There, soldiers stripped off dirty uniforms which were steamed or boiled, while the men themselves received hot showers and clean underwear. These cleansings were literal blessings. Soldiers remembered them as paradise moments when they felt human again after weeks of stench. The daily reality of the front was naturally also fatigue. Often they marched all night, then worked all day, and sleep was possible only in brief moments in shelters. No wonder soldiers resorted to various means to overcome exhaustion. Some helped themselves with strong black cigarettes and coffee if available. German command even distributed a stimulant called Pervitin to soldiers. Tablets containing methamphetamine, then considered miracle pills against fatigue. During spring 1940, in the France campaign, the Wehrmacht received over 35 million doses of Pervitin, and many soldiers swallowed it like candy at the time. The drug suppressed sleep needs and hunger feelings while providing temporary euphoric energy. Soldiers could march non-stop for 2 days and fight without rest. Very few understood its dark side. After effects wore off, exhaustion, depression, and addiction set in. Nevertheless, Pervitin saw widespread use until war's end, and some veterans returned from the front with severe drug dependencies. Alongside Pervitin, alcohol also served as popular combat aid. Regulations stipulated limited alcohol rations, for example 0.2 liters of wine or 1 shot of brandy per man, and only when situation and supplies allowed, but in practice, soldiers found ways to access alcohol. Field flasks or canteens often contained schnapps, spirits, usually distilled drinks or rum, which they used to bolster courage before attacks or drown stress after battles. On cold nights, alcohol helped warm them and numb fear. In occupied countries like France, soldiers frequently visited taverns and sampled local wines and brandies. In contrast, in the East, there was nothing to drink except potato spirit or herbal root liquor. Despite this, the rule remained that where there's a will, there's a way, and German soldiers knew how to procure alcohol drops no matter their location. More often than drunkenness, soldiers struggled with thirst due to simple water shortages, especially in summer heat or African desert conditions. Dinner at day's end was usually modest and cold. Soldiers generally received hot tea again. Coffee rarely, preferring it in mornings along with something small to eat, like pieces of durable brawn or canned goods, or few slices of smoked sausage, some cheese, or perhaps fish in oil if available. All of this, naturally, with bread or hardtack. Cooks often also distributed so-called KPV, rolls that offered variation from monotonous bread. Sometimes there was also something warm and sweet for dinner, like semolina porridge with sugar and cinnamon to help fill men before sleep. But that was more typical in rear areas. Near the front, warm dinner luxury was exceptional. As soon as darkness fell, soldiers prepared for night. Sleeping in trenches meant dividing shifts. Some men slept while others remained awake, listening for approaching enemies. Sleep was light, often interrupted by gunfire or alarms. Those who could put on everything they had for the night: coats, sweaters, blankets, and caps. Especially on the Eastern Front, winter nights were brutal, and frostbite threatened at any moment. During the cold Russian winter of 1941-42, thousands of German soldiers suffered from inadequate clothing, and many lost toes or fingers to frost. Soldiers made do as best they could, They wrapped feet in newspapers and straw, wore multiple pairs of socks, and took warm felt boots and padded coats from dead Russian soldiers because German blouses and leather boots provided inadequate insulation. Such was the reality. The soldier did what he could to survive until the next dawn. Until now, we have observed soldier life in times of relative calm. However, soon we will be transported directly to the front line, into the heat of battle where everyday life transformed into a fight for survival. In the front lines, fighting meant fear and survival. How monotonous could real life seem? The real drama emerged when orders came to advance into battle. Now we find our soldier right in the front line. Imagine a frosty morning on the Eastern Front, a gray dawn in the trenches, figures of shivering soldiers. Our soldier Hans is just taking over guard duty from his comrade. He looks over the trench edge into the fog ahead, his finger trembling on the rifle trigger. Suddenly, silence is shattered by a sharp whistle. "Incoming artillery!" comes the shout. Hans instinctively drops to the trench bottom and presses himself to the ground. Deafening explosions ring out, a hit. The first shell lands a few meters before the trench, sending earth and stones flying upward. "Take cover!" shouts the commander. But another explosion shakes the ground, flashes and rumbling. Russian artillery bombards German positions with shell barrages. Hans feels a dirt clod hit his helmet. Dust rises everywhere, stinging his eyes and smelling of explosives. His heart pounds so hard he feels it in his throat. Now it's coming, he thinks. Shrapnel whistles past his ears. From several trench places, moans can be heard. Someone has been hit. Hans wastes no time. His hands instinctively grab the spade as he feverishly deepens his cover. In that moment, training took control of his body. Although horror fills his eyes, he does exactly what he was taught. He keeps his head down, his helmet snugly held. The artillery barrage lasts what seems like an eternity, but in reality just a few minutes. Then sinister silence falls. Hans lifts his head from mud and hears only whistling in his ears. His face is shaken, blood runs from his nose. The blast force has caused it to bleed. Nearby, his comrade rises and shakes his head. Both are alive. However, a few meters away, the trench has been buried under a direct hit. Hans sees his good friend's hand sticking out, one he joked with just the night before. Now he is buried under masses of mud and wood. Death lurked at every turn, often taking soldiers at moments they least expected it. Before Hans can comprehend his friend's loss, a series of whistling sounds erupts above his head. Bullets. The first Soviet soldier who emerged from misfires from an assault rifle SVT. "Prepare weapons!" roars the commander. An infantry attack begins. Hans drops down to his rifle, lifts it over the trench edge, and searches for a target. There are many attacking Russians, rushing with shouts of "Wah!" from a nearby thicket. The German MG-42 machine gun begins its characteristic sharp roar. Fire bursts mow down the front ranks of advancing enemies. Hans sees a tall Red Army soldier in his sights. He pulls the trigger. The recoil kicks him in the shoulder. A hit. The Russian falls. Hans mechanically reloads and looks for another target. His mouth is parched as a desert. His heart races wildly. Enemy bullets whiz past his head. One can hear the short phew as a bullet whizzes through the air nearby. Often not even that. The deadly projectile comes unexpectedly, and those who hear it are already dead. Hans shoots again and yet again. The enemies do not diminish. Some have already reached the trench. Close combat ensues. A Russian soldier jumps into the trench with a bayonet, lunging at one of Hans's friends. In the ensuing chaos, Hans throws away his rifle. Nearby is the long shovel, and he brandishes his field spade. The sharp spade edge is a deadly weapon. He lunges at the attacker and strikes him hard with the spade edge to the neck. The Soviet collapses, gasping for breath. Hans looks away. He has no time to feel anything as another enemy targets him. Hans dodges, and in that moment he sees the Soviet soldier staggering. He has been shot by a bullet from Hans's sergeant's pistol. Phew! Hans breathes out. It's over. He looks around. There is much smoke, cries of the injured, groaning. The attack was repelled. The surviving Russians retreat back into fog, some crying out in pain. German soldiers, with their last strength, hold the line. They fire a few rounds as farewell. Then silence descends, interrupted only by wounded moans. Only now does Hans realize what has happened. He shakes from cold and shock. In the corner of the trench lies his good friend Fritz with vacant eyes, a red stain on his chest. A bullet has hit him in the heart. Hans feels his stomach rise. Before he can do anything, he simply vomits. This was his first battle, yet there is no time to recover. The commander is issuing orders: establish a defense, replenish ammunition, tend to the wounded. Hans, in a daze, obediently gathers his rifle and counts bullets. His body functions on autopilot. His hands do what they have practiced so many times. Only in the evening, when calm returns and adrenaline subsides, does Hans fall to the ground, exhausted. He shakes with sobs, even though no one sees him. He has just experienced what is dryly termed in military handbooks as the first baptism of fire. Every frontline soldier goes through this. Some were petrified with fear and did not move. Others acted like in a trance. But most, despite the terror, fulfilled their duty. They continued to fight because they had to. As one veteran said, "First battle. You're so scared you could almost piss yourself, but then you shake it off or else you can't stay there." Such direct confrontations occurred on the front day in and day out. Germans attacked or defended against Allies in many battlefields simultaneously, in endless Russian steppes, in the African desert, in dense Italian mountains, and in Normandy beach bunkers. The experience of fighting varied with environment. On the Eastern Front, enormous tank battles and encirclements occurred, where hundreds of thousands of soldiers clashed simultaneously. For instance, at Stalingrad or Kursk, German units fell by the thousands and soldiers experienced some of the most terrible conditions in warfare history. Over 6 months of continuous fighting, bombardments, starvation, and brutal winters. In the ruined streets of Stalingrad, they fought for every building. Cellars were full of injured and dying, streets were covered with corpses, and no one took prisoners. The German soldier faced not only the Soviet enemy, but also minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit, hunger, and total exhaustion. Hunger, 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 and lice. Day and night we are attacked by planes and artillery almost without a break. If a miracle doesn't happen, we'll perish, recorded a desperate corporal encircled at Stalingrad at the turn of 1942-43. As situations became hopeless, many soldiers still wrote final letters home to say their goodbyes. "By the time you receive this letter, your son will no longer be in this world," wrote one of the German defenders of Stalingrad to his parents in January 1943, adding, "Yet we will continue to fight for our beloved homeland, my hometown, for our family, and for our leader." These heartbreaking lines indeed reached his mother only after the war. Her son had fallen, just like 90,000 other German soldiers who died in Stalingrad's ruins or fell into Soviet captivity. On the Western Front, battles were different. For example, in Normandy 1944, German soldiers faced overwhelming superior numbers of Allied tanks and artillery in continuous air raids. Allied bombers and fighter planes dominated the sky, so German soldiers had to hide from pilots' watchful eyes during the day, or risk getting destroyed. One veteran from Normandy described that enemy aircraft were worse than 100 Russian tanks. They whizzed overhead from morning to night, and as soon as someone moved on the road, they were already firing at them. Constant air raids destroyed supply columns, leaving soldiers hungry and thirsty, even where there would otherwise be plenty of food. Nevertheless, in fighting in Western Europe, there was a slightly greater chance of survival if a soldier surrendered in time. Western allies took prisoners more often than the furious Soviets to the east. By war's end, many German soldiers in the West chose to surrender to British or Americans rather than fall into Red Army hands, which was notorious for harsh retribution. Still, there was fierce fighting in the West as well. The destroyed cities of Cannes, Aachen, or the Battle of the Bulge are proof of that. where Germans still mounted mass attacks in December 1944 one last time. In all these encounters, it held true that every mistake could be fatal. Soldiers had to face enormous stress, loud explosions tearing eardrums, shockwaves knocking them to the ground, pain from injuries, the omnipresent cries of wounded comrades for help. Many found themselves on the brink of collapse. The German army had field doctors and so-called field hospitals, to which the wounded were taken, but it was not always possible to evacuate everyone from battle. A severely injured soldier often died before help arrived. Medics did what they could. They risked their lives to pull the injured from fire, but the reality was cruel. A large percentage of German soldiers fell or were maimed. A total of around 5.3 million German soldiers died in the war, and another approximately 7 million were injured. The chances of surviving several years of continuous fighting at the front were slim. Soldiers were aware of this and created various superstitions. For instance, if someone got bluewurst, a hit that sprayed blood like a sausage, they considered themselves lucky because they were already out of the fight. Often the injured cried tears of joy at being evacuated from battle with a graze to their hand or foot. Paradoxically, joy at painful injury highlighted how terrifying it was to remain healthy and have to continue fighting. Some unfortunate souls even tried to injure themselves deliberately to get out of the front line by shooting their arm or leg. However, when such simulators were caught, they faced military court and strict penalties, including execution for cowardice. The German army implemented draconian measures to maintain its combat effectiveness. The military police monitored to ensure that no one fled from battle, and saboteurs and suspicious deserters were often shot on the spot. Throughout the war, Nazi military courts executed about 15,000 of their own soldiers. In comparison, the German army executed only 48 in World War I. The fear of their own leaders and Hitler's orders, retreat is not allowed by a step, kept many soldiers fighting even in seemingly hopeless situations. Combat deployments peaked in the last months of the war directly on German soil. As Allied forces penetrated the Third Reich in winter and spring 1945, the German soldier experienced a situation he had previously imposed on foreign lands. The war had returned home. Many soldiers worried about their families, having seen cities in Germany burning under Allied bombs. Additionally, reports of Soviet reprisals targeted the East. Wehrmacht soldiers knew that after the horrors they inflicted in the USSR, civilians in Germany would now face cruel retribution. This was another motivation for them to hold the front until their last breath. "We are now defending our homes from the Red Army," propaganda proclaimed. Fighting continued to the bitter end, even though victory was clearly impossible. For example, in April 1945, in the streets of Berlin, Nazis deployed the last remnants of the army, elderly and underage boys from the Volkssturm Home Guard, against a massive force of Soviet tanks. Starved veterans who had survived 5 years of fighting stood next to 16-year-old boys from the Hitler Youth with Panzerfausts. Many of them fell within minutes of fighting. The morale of most units was by then at rock bottom. Soldiers knew it was over, but they could not retreat. Some still defended fanatically, while others surrendered at the first opportunity. Some even committed suicide in despair rather than walking into captivity. Under these conditions, all remnants of military order crumbled. Yet it is striking that most German units fought organized until the very capitulation. This testifies to tough discipline, and that many soldiers were determined to fulfill their duty, whether out of fanatical conviction, fear, or simply loyalty to their comrades. We have experienced battle horrors with our soldier. Soon we will attempt to unveil what was going on in these men's minds, how they maintained morale, what they believed in, and how they coped with extreme stresses of wartime years. Morale, faith, and soldiers' thoughts. As letters and acts of courage in battle hinted, the life of a Nazi soldier was not just about physically surviving each day, but also about an ongoing psychological struggle. What did these men actually feel and think? Were they blinded fanatics or just ordinary people thrown into the whirlpool of events? The answer is complicated and different for each. One thing is certain: every soldier had to find a way to cope psychologically with daily stress, fear, and losses. Initially, during victorious campaigns from 1939 to 1941, many German soldiers experienced euphoria and belief in victory. The lightning defeats of Poland and France lifted morale to its highest. Soldiers believed they were part of an invincible army. Propaganda reinforced the notion that they were waging a just war and that the Führer, their leader, knew exactly what he was doing. During the invasion of the Soviet Union in summer 1941, many soldiers truly believed they were going to liberate the world from Bolshevism and that by Christmas, they would be home as victors. Letters from the first weeks of Operation Barbarossa are full of excitement. "The Russians are fleeing in every direction. We will soon be in Moscow," wrote a tank soldier home in July 1941. However, as time went on, reality proved harsh. Losses mounted, the war stretched into winter, and quick victory was not forthcoming. Morale began to waver. Soldiers were exhausted and sobered up from their original illusions. Yet a sense of duty still prevailed. According to modern research such as that of historian Sir Kenneth, who analyzed secretly intercepted conversations of German prisoners, most ordinary soldiers did not contemplate Nazi ideology or grand war aims at all. Their daily thoughts revolved around completely different matters. When would they get to eat? How was their family? What would happen in the next battle? "I'll do my job and not let my comrades down." Kenneth found that soldiers over time created their own closed world where violence became a normal means of survival and the main values were loyalty to the unit and the basic effort to stay alive. Most German soldiers did not fight out of fervent conviction regarding Nazi ideology, but simply because it was their job, and they hung on each other like brothers. Many perceived World War II similarly to the first as a struggle for the existence of their homeland against enemies. They may have heard of the horrific Nazi plans for the genocide of the Jews or dominating Europe, but in the trenches, they did not wrestle with such ideas. Their world shrank to the nearest circle: their company, their commander, their weapon, and the closest fight. This kept them sane. However, this does not mean that Nazi ideology did not play a role. It was rather a sort of backdrop on which the soldier's psyche functioned. Propaganda also operated under the harsh conditions of the front. For example, many German soldiers believed until the end that they were fighting in a just defensive war against hordes of barbarians, be they Soviet or Anglo-American. As the situation worsened, Hitler and Goebbels sent fiery speeches about fighting for the salvation of Germany into the ether, and many exhausted soldiers in the trenches found encouragement to resist further. An example can be the fanatical order from spring 1945, where Hitler insisted that everyone defend to the last man. Even though many ignored this order, others gritted their teeth and continued to fight. The fear of reprisals also kept soldiers in check. They knew that if they showed cowardice or defiance, a cruel punishment awaited them from their own. A field court and execution or a bullet. The 13,000 to 15,000 German soldiers executed by their command during the war speaks volumes. "I'll shoot anyone who retreats," one officer reportedly declared before the Battle of Kursk. Such threats were certainly not made in vain and effectively maintained morale, although this morale was based on fear rather than enthusiasm. Nevertheless, we cannot overlook the camaraderie and human bonds that were perhaps the most crucial factor in morale. Soldiers often reported that they fought primarily for their buddies beside them. In shared danger, deep friendships were forged. Men supported each other, lent their last cigarette, helped an injured comrade, and collectively complained about the lousy weather and those in charge, meaning the high commanders in safety. To survive the war meant to survive it together. When someone from the company fell, the rest avenged him with even greater fury. Loyalty to the unit became a stronger motivation than loyalty to Hitler. One German sergeant in Eastern Europe reportedly replied to someone reminding him he could surrender. "Because the war was lost. I now have my family here in our battalion. I cannot leave them." Many shared such feelings. Thanks to the cohesion of small combat groups, the German army managed to function even in situations where other armies would have long since disintegrated. War crimes were not commonly discussed among soldiers, at least not with accusations. The reality is that many Nazi soldiers either actively participated in or witnessed brutal acts. The murder of civilians, massacres of prisoners, plundering villages. On the Eastern Front, German units committed horrific atrocities in anti-partisan actions. Or the Holocaust. They shot women and children in retaliation for partisan attacks, helped SS units exterminate the Jewish population, or let Soviet prisoners starve to death. How could ordinary soldiers psychologically bear this? Partly it was made possible by the very presence of ideology, which became a tool for self-justification.